High-end audio is full of competing technologies: analog versus digital sources, Class A versus Class D amps, horn versus dome tweeters, and one of the most polarizing competitions is between tubes and solid state. I've been listening to high-end audio for around 2 decades, but for whatever reason I've always ended up in the solid state camp. So the arrival of Rogue Audio's all-tube Cronus Dark integrated amplifier marked my first opportunity to really get to know a tube component. As a result, this review is aimed primarily at listeners who are new to tube gear, and you know what? The Rogue is awesome. My name is Aaonr Jenkins, and here on the Absolute Sounds YouTube channel, I review products that are affordable, appealing to those of us who listen to music in real-world, often shared spaces, or both. The Cronus Dark costs $4,495, which, while not inexpensive, is pretty reasonable by the standards of high-end audio. Rogue also sells a regular version of the amp called the Cronus Magnum 3 for $1,000 less. And besides the black casework, the Dark's higher price tag gets you higher quality parts, such as a bigger power supply, rhodium-plated binding posts, better op amps in the built-in phono stage, and better signal tubes. Tubes, of course, refers to vacuum tubes, which are used in both the Cronus's preamplifier, the small tubes, and power amplifier circuits, those are the big tubes. All electronics were tube-based way back when, but the transition to solid-state transistors, which are smaller, more reliable, more efficient, faster, less expensive, and so on, began in the 1950s, and for decades now, solid-state has been the standard just about everywhere. Except in high-end audio, where tubes have lived on simply because their many fans think they sound better. All of the Rogue's tubes are visible on top of the amp, although the large power tubes aren't installed when it arrives. They come individually wrapped and numbered for their intended socket. Once you've installed them, you then have to set the tube bias, which ensures that each amp receives the correct voltage. It's kind of like setting the idle speed in a car. The bias procedure is simple and well explained in the owner's manual. You just open a little hatch in the top of the amp, use a small tool that's included, and turn a dial to set the bias according to the gauge on top of the amp. It took less than a minute to set the bias, and Rogue recommends rebiasing the tubes every few months. The Cronus Dark also allows you to match its output to your speaker's impedance. It's set to 8 ohms at the factory, but you can change it to 4 ohms. To do so, you'll need to remove the power tubes, unscrew and remove the top cover, then inside, remove a nut, swap a pair of wires, and reinstall the nut. You also need to pop the top off the amp if you want to adjust the built-in phonostage's cartridge loading, which is variable from 30 ohms to 47,000, or its gain, which can be set to 60 decibels for moving coil cartridges or 40 decibels for moving magnet cartridges. On the front panel of the amp, you'll find the power button, a sensor for the remote control, a 1/4-inch headphone jack, and knobs for source, balance, and volume. The amp comes with a remote, although it only controls the volume, up, down, and mute. To turn on the amp or change the input, you'll need to turn the appropriate knob on the front face. On the amp's back panel, you have 2 sets of binding posts for the speaker cables, the power inlet, a fuse, a grounding plug for a turntable, and 6 pairs of analog RCA jacks. 4 are inputs, one of which is specifically for the built-in photo stage, and then there are 2 sets of outputs. One is fixed and level, the other is variable. There's also a switch that allows you to select triode or ultralinear mode. These are just 2 different circuits inside the amp which present different voltages to the tube. You can switch them on the fly and then just see whichever one sounds better with your speakers. With each of the 3 pairs of speakers I listen to through the Rogue, the less powerful lower distortion triode mode, which produces around 55 watts per channel, sounded better than the 100-watt ultralinear, which had audibly more distortion. A quick aside, those tubes have a limited lifespan. Rogue says the power tubes are generally good for around 3,000 hours, or 3 years if you use the amp a few hours every day, and the smaller tubes generally lasting at least 5,000 hours. 4 new KT88 power tubes will set you back a few $100, but that also provides a good opportunity to switch to a different brand or rating if you want to try a different sound. You can of course do this kind of tube rolling anytime, you'll just need to reset the new tube's bias afterwards. While it's not particularly large at 18 by 18 inches, the Cronus is very heavy. It weighs 55 pounds. It also gets very warm, with each of the 4 power tubes getting hot enough that you won't want to touch them. Needless to say, you'll need to leave several inches of space for proper ventilation. And beyond installing the tubes, the owner's manual mentions a few items to watch out for, such as if you turn the amp off, make sure you wait 1 minute before turning it back on. Don't operate the amp unless it's connected to a speaker, and of course, don't remove the top unless the amp has been turned off for an hour to allow the lethal voltages inside to dissipate. But if this sounds a little bit fiddly, it's really not, as long as you don't have to dig into the amp's internals. The experience of using the Cronus is similar to that of a turntable. You'll regularly have to lay hands on it, if only to turn it on. So how does the Rogue Audio Cronus Dark sound? It took a while to find out because it took several weeks before the amp was fully broken in, and in the shorter term, the Rogue always sounds better after it's been playing for 10 to 15 minutes, presumably because that's the time it takes for the tubes to fully warm up. In any case, three things stood out about its sound. First, in a word, the Cronus Dark's sound is rich and full-bodied, liquid, smooth, and warm. But not warm as in bright, warm as in human. It makes the trumpets of Cootie Williams and Kenny Dorham sound more soulful, the voices of Mavis Staples and Lana Del Rey more bewitching, the piano and guitars in Leon Russell's Stranger in a Strange Land and All of Them Witches, The Marriage of Coyote Women, more expressive. But it's not a sound that immediately grabs your attention with fireworks and excitement. It's a sound that draws you in viscerally, emotionally, with an innate sense of realism. In the mid-range especially, the Rogue delivers a very saturated sound. Yo-Yo Ma's cello sounds deep and rich, full-bodied and fleshed out, detailed and textured, haunting and sometimes hair-raising. But you can say the same thing of the guitars that opened Leonard Skinner's The Ballads of Curtis Loew, Prince's Purple Rain, the violins in AWOL Nation's Run, or Frank Sinatra's voice in My Way. The sound is also smooth and liquid. The amp just doesn't know how to do harsh. Notes and vocals gel together organically and flow smoothly. This also helps to create a distinct acoustic space, such as the smoky atmosphere of a jazz club or the large majesty of a concert hall. And sometimes it produces discontinuity, where you can hear that a singer was recording a different sonic space than the accompanying instruments. Subjectively, it's a beautiful sound. A friend who came over for a listening session described it as what you wish music always sounded like, and I don't disagree. If it grabs you, it's just intoxicating, as well as very, very believable. There is a small flip side here in that, compared to the two solid-state amplifiers I currently have in-house, the Rogue casts a very slight veil, coloration, over the music. As one example, sound rarely emerges from an empty black background. Instead, it's part of a bigger, organic acoustic sound field, and more noticeably, separate musical lines aren't as clearly delineated, once again being part of that whole rather than distinct elements. So, if you're looking for complete neutrality and transparency and clarity, the Rogue probably isn't the right fit for you, unless, of course, you get seduced by the beauty of it all instead. That rich, liquid organicness is only part of the Rogue's magic. This is an amplifier that will get your head nodding, fingers snapping, arms pumping, or whatever. The choruses of Louis Prima's Just a Gigolo, the bass guitar riffs in ZZ Top's Cheap Sunglasses, and absolutely everything in Beethoven's Ode to Joy simply swell with energy. Slower and quieter pieces, from Tchaikovsky's Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairies to Beyoncé's Daughter or Molotov's Gimme the Power, have that same sense of energy, but they're suitably restrained. And in both cases, and really with all music that I listen to, the Rogue's pace, rhythm, and timing are excellent. Notes stop and start precisely and naturally, and there's a real feeling of coherence to the musical whole, like a live set that's come together absolutely perfectly. At the same time, the Rogue isn't overpowering in any way. Its energy feels natural and honest, not like a kind of byproduct of the technology, as you sometimes hear in an overly detailed DAC. There's no flip side to this unless you wanted an amp solely to play background music while you were working or studying, and in which case the Rogue is going to prove a terrible distraction, because I always found myself wanting to turn it up and just get sucked into the music. And third, Prior to this review, I knew of two supposed truisms of tube amps. First, they have a magical mid-range, and second, they have comparatively weak bass. And with the Rogue, the former was definitely case, and the latter, much less so. The Cronus Dark isn't at all bass deficient. It has a prolific low end, which is almost as rich and liquid as its mid-range. Electronic bass notes from Yellow's Oh Yeah and Psy's Gangnam Style to Y2K's La 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 and Lotto's Big Energy are distinct and punchy, and stand-up bass like in Charles Mingus's Goodbye Pork Pie Hat and electric bass like Aram Bedrosian's Weightless sound very full and very close to the real thing. The Rogue also drove all three pairs of speakers I tried it with to as deep a frequency as my solid-state amps, but the tube amp just couldn't match the other amps' low-end impact and control. The bass simply wasn't as weighty or hard-hitting, and the individual notes were a little less taut and precise. But if those things are important to you, tube amps in general likely won't be the best choice. And while the difference I'm describing was real and distinct, the Rogue's bass was still very musically satisfying and of a piece with the rest of its frequency range. And just as important, that relative touch of looseness didn't diminish at all the overall musical coherence or timing. While I'm not a big user of vinyl, I was very curious to hear the Rogue's built-in phono stage. For this, I used the Fluence RT81 turntable. It's very inexpensive at $249, a price that includes its own built-in preamp, but for the money, it sounds pretty good. Smooth, relaxed, with solid presence and body, if not a whole lot of detail. Or at least that's how it sounded through its own preamp, or when funneled through the preamp in the NAD C389 integrated amp. When I plugged it into the Rogue, the Fluence's heart instantly grew 3 sizes, with things like clarity, power, timing, and scale vastly increasing. The improvement was so dramatic that I immediately wished I had a higher-end turntable on hand with which to dig deeper into this preamp. There was clearly a lot of potential I wasn't able to tap into. On a personal level, the Rogue Audio Cronus Dark is the most musically engaging product I've reviewed to date. It was easy to get sucked into music for hours thanks to the rich liquid sound, the driving pace, rhythm, and timing, and honestly, the visceral and emotional connection it provided. The Rogue worked well with every genre and artist I tried, and ultimately, it redefined my view of what the experience of recorded music in my room could be. As much as I enjoyed it, the Rogue won't appeal to everyone. Its modest bass limitations will deter some listeners, while its hands-on nature, including having to replace tubes every few years, will deter others. But if you're just getting into high-end audio, or if you're considering crossing that line from solid-state to tubes, I can't recommend auditioning the Rogue highly enough. On a personal note, the Rogue Audio Cronus Dark is the most musically engaging product I've reviewed to date. It was easy to get sucked into music for hours thanks to its rich liquid sound, its driving pace, rhythm, and timing, and honestly, the visceral and emotional connection it provided. The Rogue worked well with every genre and artist I tried, and ultimately, it redefined my view of what recorded music could sound like in my room. But as much as I enjoyed it, the Rogue won't appeal to everyone. Those modest bass limitations will deter some listeners, while its hands-on nature, and especially having to replace those tubes every few years, may well deter others. But if you're just getting into high-end audio, or if you're considering crossing that line from solid-state to tubes, I can't recommend auditioning the Rogue Audio Cronus Dark highly enough. It might well change your mind about what recorded music can be.